He had at times simply married himself to someone else. Sometimes there was someone that did it, and sometimes he did it himself. But no one knows exactly how many wives or how many women he married. And in a number of cases, the women remained with their own husbands.
I understand that the girls there are given in marriage at the age of 14, as young as the age of 14. And it doesn't necessarily depend on who she's in love with or who she wants, it's who wants her.
I know he had 5 wives, and I know I came from the 4th wife, I think. But not a lot of stories were ever told. My grandfather won't talk about it. So consequently, my dad didn't know a whole lot. Grandma didn't talk about it. They just kept it real quiet.
I think Joseph Smith in particular was a ladies' man. He was very interested in women. He was charismatic. He was charming. He was powerful. And women liked him, and he liked women.
They were sort of forced into it. The first wives, they couldn't do anything about it. Whether they liked it or not, they had to put up with it, and they didn't like it.
They questioned why in that, but they knew that it had come from God. I mean, even the prophet Joseph Smith hesitated on his, as I say, for almost 10 years to even talk to the other members of the church about it, because he knew the opposition that would bring. And it was only because they knew it came from God that they were willing to do it.
I've had to look upon it as a mistake, but I don't think a lot of positive things happened as a result of polygamy being part of the church.
In 1830, Joseph Smith, a young man in Palmyra, New York, created a religion which he called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormon Church. This church was based on the teachings of the Bible and of a book which Joseph Smith claimed he translated from plates of gold given to him by an angel. He called the book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon is said to be a history of an ancient civilization that inhabited this continent before Columbus came to America. Along with the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith claimed to have many other prophecies which he declared were to usher in a new dispensation. He taught that the gospel of Jesus Christ was being restored and that Jesus himself would soon return to his people, bearing with him all the gifts of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. One of these restoration doctrines which Joseph Smith proposed was what he called the principle of celestial marriage, or plurality of wives, otherwise known as polygamy.
Come, girls, come and listen to my noise. Don't you marry the Mormon boy. If you do, your fortunate will be. Johnny cake and babies is all you'll see.
The practice of polygamy was discontinued by the Mormon Church in 1890, although there are some polygamist factions that still exist. Most Mormons, whether polygamist or otherwise, have had to come to terms with this doctrine in their theology. In the next few minutes, we're going to explore the different experiences both men and women have had in relating to their history of polygamy. Each person is relating their own experience and should not be regarded as speaking for the Mormon Church as a whole.
Johnny cake and babies is all you.
Polygamy to me is the Mormon Church concept, which is a man having many wives. And originally in our church it was considered something important to do in order to obtain eternal life. You know, so it was a religious commitment and a way to live that had one man as the head of the household, or households, and many wives, lots of children.
2 or 3 years after the church was restored, the prophet Joseph Smith was making an extensive study of the Old Testament, came across the patriarchs of the Old Testament who were obviously polygamists. And yet they were recognized as being some of the greatest men in the Old Testament, including Abraham and Moses. And Joseph Smith was inquiring of the Lord, what is the nature of this? Are these people, is it a contrary teaching? And at the time, God revealed to him that polygamy was a legitimate practice if directed by God.
whether or not it was something he understood or some vision or dream that he had or his hormones, loved women. I think he loved men too, by the way. Not in the same way that he loved. Don't misunderstand me. I don't think that he was involved in homosexuality or
He loved people.
but he loved people.
And again, I depart some from the traditional beliefs about this, that I don't buy the whole story, but the story, according to traditional Mormon belief, is that Joseph Smith was told of God that it was right and appropriate and even necessary for him to take more wives.
There are indications that he was having relationships with women early on, long before he theoretically had a revelation about reinstating polygamy. He saw himself, if not early, at least later, as the great prophet of the latter days who was going to restore all things from the Bible, including polygamy.
He resisted it, he hesitated, it went against all his moral fiber, against his upbringing. He was brought up in a Victorian society. His parents were primarily Methodists. It was just very contrary, and he hesitated to reveal it to the rest of the members of the church for that very reason. He didn't feel comfortable with it, and he was later directed even more thoroughly and threateningly, I suppose, in keeping God's commandments. And it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 1841 or later, almost 10 years after the original revelation, that he actually practiced, or polygamy became a practice in the church.
And in fact, many people who had joined the church at the time didn't realize he was practicing polygamy, even his own wife.
He brought Eliza Snow into the home, and I think Eliza was quite a bit younger than Emma. And I think that she was supposedly there to help take care of the children, but in fact, she was one of his wives.
She did believe that he was a prophet of God, and that this was a revelation from time to time, and she actually lived with other of his wives in her home, and she also was upset regularly and kicked them out and demanded that he cease the practice of polygamy. She felt like many women would feel, I think, personally very threatened.
She remained true and faithful to him till his death. He martyred him in 1844, so she didn't seem to have any real, she didn't believe him, and she understood apparently the situation.
And she had some feelings of resentment about the loss of her husband, because they were deeply in love when they were originally married. And I think he felt the loss of that relationship. I don't know, but I think it's very possible that he started feeling severed from a male-female relationship and was searching for other ways to, I don't know. I mean, even as I'm speaking, I'm asking myself, how could this be, a man in such a position of power who would institute the practice of polygamy?
According to church records, 25 wives over the course of his lifetime. And if you read the book No Man Knows My History by Von Brody about Joseph Smith, he had 50 wives. Both claim they can document. So who knows? I don't care how many he had. He did have more than one. And definitely not the norm.
The biography of Elizabeth Mills Ogden Whitaker, including being lost at sea, her life in Nauvoo, and of crossing the plains, her great love affair, how it ended, and her life in polygamy, which she hated. She hated polygamy. Then her life in Centerville, Utah.
Yeah, from the things that I have read, the evidence that I've looked at, it seems clear that he consummated many of his marriages and many relationships that were not marriages, that either were not at the time or that were later. Later he decided he didn't need those women in his group. He would allow their husbands to keep them. He had relationships with women who were single and also with women who were married to other men.
it also broke a lot of hearts. There are many stories of women who accepted the practice of polygamy and accepted and supported what are known as sister wives, but they didn't have the one-to-one intensity of the relationship with their spouse that they might have imagined in their childhoods.
Brigham called all the able-bodied men that were able to earn a living. There were a lot of converts coming in. Most of them were young girls. They had even been converted and left families in England and so on. There was an influx of young unmarried girls, and he told all these men that had a good livelihood and they could afford it to marry one of those girls so they could have families.
You know, as the community grew, the Mormons were displacing people who had lived there for long times, and they resisted that, and they tried to fight the Mormons, and there was lots of turmoil and contention. Joseph actually set up an army. They had he was creating his own kingdom. He offended many people, and they fought against him. And so the saints eventually needed to move to survive because their enemies, were so angry with them. Joseph was eventually shot and killed by people who were angry with him, and Brigham Young took over the leadership of the church and moved the saints far enough west that they thought they could have their own kingdom.
I suppose because it was truth. They were teaching truth, and people couldn't handle it. Same reasons that Christ was persecuted. I think that people, for some reason, the world, as in the time of Christ, they fought the things that were undermining them because it was truth.
Brigham Young was the prophet and president of the church after Joseph Smith was killed. And Brigham Young actually led the Mormon people from Nauvoo, Illinois, out west to the Great Salt Lake, where they planned to have greater religious freedom and more ability to practice their beliefs without being questioned or persecuted by their neighbors.
He had sworn to her that he'd never marry in polygamy, but then he figured that what the Lord asked was more important than just his word to her. So he was going to marry, because the church asked him to, another woman, a girl. And she was furious. She didn't want it, but he did it anyway.
But they could only take upon themselves another additional wife responsibility with approval from the leadership of the church. It was not a practice that anybody could just decide, well, I want to marry have more than one wife. It was a thing that had to be done under the direction of the leadership of the church. Not for any immoral reasons, but for whatever reasons that God wanted it to be the case, or the reason for it.
Mm-hmm. My grandmother, who was raised by her grandmother, who was a polygamous wife, never saw her grandfather. He lived in another state, and she had many bitter feelings about how her own grandmother was abandoned by this man who had fathered 3 children and then left. Not as a step to abandon the family or to institute a divorce, but he had other responsibilities in other places.
Grandpa promised Grandma that he'd never marry in polygamy if she'd marry him. And then Brigham called them together and told them about all these girls. And then she says, he didn't marry one of those girls. He married a younger daughter out of the Wadhams family that had 11 children. That made her madder than ever. He didn't marry one of those poor little girls that were brought over.
Most plural marriages proved to be happy. 50% of them, statistics that were made, were highly successful. 25% moderately successful, and 25% had serious difficulties. Mm-hmm. So probably a greater success rate than the normal marriages.
For women who could not have children of their own, and children feeling like the most important thing in the world to women, the sister wives and sister wives without children could be very much involved with children, very much loving and caring for children. There were instances also of wives actually giving children. This child can be yours, you can, and it was done, with real love and caring.
women's feelings about polygamy in the 1860s and 70s were all over the map. Many women yearned for the opportunity to be involved in a polygamous marriage. It was thought of in some circles as a high status.
The biggest problem always was in the women getting along with each other. If there's a factor involved in polygamy working or not working, it always had to do with the women being able to get along with one another.
He brought her right home, and Grandma was supposed to welcome her in and take care of her. She had a child at barely 9 months, and Grandma had to nurse her for that. And they just hated each other for years.
Did they live in the same house?
Yes. Terrible. But you'll have to read it. I can't say it to you.
The women involved in the plural relationships were the strongest supporters of it, and the ones that spoke most for it. I think they saw the successes of it in the raising of their families and that. They recognized the caring man who was faithful to their family, to his family responsibilities. You didn't find them abandoning their family responsibilities like we see in the world today.
They supported each other. There are wonderful examples of women who were able to go to medical school, leaving children at home with their sister wives, feeling like they would be well cared for.
My own great-grandmother was very bitter about her experience with polygamy because she basically lost her husband after he started taking on other wives. She was very bitter about it to the point where she left the church.
So I knew it was very unfair, and we all knew that. But it's the only way to quickly populate the communities.
Almost everyone that was recommended or suggested by the prophets that they should enter into a plural marriage fought it at first. Here's Brigham Young's statement recording his feelings when it was first introduced to him. If any man had asked me what my choice was when Joseph Smith revealed that doctrine, plurality of wives, provided that it would not diminish my glory, I would have said, let me have but one wife. I was not desirous of shrinking from any duty, nor failing in the least to do as I was commanded, but it was the first time in my life that I desired the grave, and I could hardly get over it for a long time.
What I have read is men making statements that it was not easy, that this is no picnic. Clearly the idea of the world is that they were lechers, that they loved going to bed with different women every night, that they were having a ball and calling it legal and feeling righteous instead of feeling guilty about what other men might do secretly. But the ones who spoke about it themselves, said, if you think this is a picnic, you've got to be kidding.
I see nothing wrong with polygamy. I see nothing wrong with what you would call plurality. I see nothing wrong with sexuality between mature adults. If there's anything wrong with it, it's the way and manner in which it's used to take power or control over someone else. So to me, polygamy is only wrong in that it sets the king up at the head of the house, and these women are in subjection to either he or the first wife.
Polygamy was established that there are all these girls, no husbands. And Brigham Young was told, had the revelation to see that these girls got husbands.
Many people believed that if they were called to practice polygamy and didn't do it, that it would be considered unrighteous or a sin upon their head, and that if they were called to practice polygamy, that they should do it. And I think that there was a belief that there would be blessings that they would experience, whether it was blessings of a large family or blessings of some other nature. That was not clear. It wasn't a point of doctrine that if you do this, this will be the blessing. But it was generally thought that if you didn't do it and you were called to do it, that would be a negative on your side.
I think that there would probably be some people that would practice polygamy for wrong reasons as well, and not fulfill their responsibilities to those families. I think that there's a fine line there where immorality could be a part of the motivation.
Maybe there was a purpose to it. Maybe there was some good that came of it. As I say, I probably wouldn't exist as a physical human being if my great-grandparents hadn't practiced polygamy.
But I did believe in the concept. The concept was there, and so we entered into. Actually, a woman approached Dana, and who believed in polygamy, but not polygamy, but plurality. Plurality is that they're all equal, that there's no one that makes the rules for the rest.
John Whitsoe, who was an apostle in the church, said, "We do not understand why the Lord commanded the practice of plural marriage. Some have suggested that it was a means of trying and refining the people through the persecution that followed." And my experience with it, I think that that's been very true. Some of the strongest families, the most united, and the ones who have the strongest testimonies have come through the polygynous relationships.
That whole idea of romantic love and perfect togetherness doesn't fit well with polygamy. What does fit well, actually, is something that we may be having a movement towards in the United States anyhow, which may mean something for polygamy, and that is women loving and supporting one another. And if that's the ideal, is for women to have a society of women, of loving, supportive, concerned, caring people who make a spiritually binding, if not legal, but possibly legal commitment to one another as a group, that bodes well for polygamy.
And I experienced some things that were quite wonderful in it. If a woman or a man can have that kind of love, be surrounded by that kind of love, at times it's just as bad the other way, But you get an experience of feeling something experiencing something that you'll never ever experience any other way.
Well, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, headquartered in Salt Lake City, Utah, the practice of polygamy within that church was eliminated by direction, in the same direction that directed it to start, was God commanded it to stop being practiced for whatever reason, and that was stopped and discontinued in 1890.
The government of the United States was really going to destroy the church financially and politically. They were imprisoning all the church leaders, and it became clear that the church would be ruined if they didn't denounce polygamy, and so they did. They excommunicate anyone that they're aware of practicing polygamy. There are many Mormon offshoot groups that do practice polygamy that feel that they are, doing the will of God.
At that point, I knew it was something Dan wanted very, very much, and if I didn't go along with it, I knew I'd be out of the picture. He'd go on and find someone else that would, because he wanted it that badly. She and I talked about how it was going to be, how we'd all be equal. We would share in this and we would share in that, and as far as the sexuality goes, we would all three be together. Maybe not at the beginning, but and this is where I began to feel some of my doubt.
If it were to be reinstituted, which actually, that is such a far-out, long-shot question, I can't imagine it. Most people who are modern-day Mormons talk about it as a no thank you, and are very appalled by it. Because we're Americanized, we're part of the American culture. It's not something we could foresee. I think it would alienate, I'd say 90+% of Mormons today.
I don't think it will be. I don't think it's the purposes for which I see it having been practiced have been fulfilled. The church has. I don't think the church would have lasted the first 50 years had it not been for the introduction of polygamy, because I think it's that persecution that enabled to build the strength of the church in that early day, and that's been fulfilled. It's a strong, solid organization now.
I think it was basically a hardship. I can see the ideal situation and its appeals, but, in my own family history, it looks like it was a hardship. And I don't see a need for it. I don't see that the numbers require it, and I don't believe in it as a religious principle myself. I don't believe that it will ever be required of me. and I would not choose it. If I did choose it, what I would be looking for is the relationship of the women.
And it finally got to where I was the one that couldn't handle it anymore, and I said, you know, I can't handle it anymore, I'm going to leave. You know, if this is what you two want, that's fine, you stay, I'm leaving. And at that point she said, no, you guys have been together for 30 years, and I've only known him for 6 months, I'll leave. And so we separated.
I mean, I have enough problem handling one family. I don't want the responsibilities of additional families. Well, my wife said that if God commanded it, she could handle it. Whether she could or not at the time, I don't know.
I've been able to come to terms with this mostly through the principle of not wanting to throw out the baby with the bathwater. That I think it's inevitable when people get involved in establishing organizations and working through how to set up a structure, how to establish practices and procedures, mistakes are made. And frankly, I look at this as one of them.
And that is to have people who love you, more than one person who loves you that deeply. So it was a great experience for me. But it turns out again that the women, you know, it doesn't work very well. The women, for one reason or other, have problems with it.
They'd bring their lunch and they'd have a lovely lunch, and then they would play cards. And once they heard Grandpa coming just as they were right in the middle of a lovely game. But Grandma, she'd been washing or serving, and she had a white apron on. And she just put her arms like this, swept them up to the apron, folded her apron. And they were all sitting there visiting, just as sweet as could be. And Grandpa never knew a thing about it.
The feminist in me is awkward and uncomfortable at times, acknowledging that I am a Latter-day Saint, a member of this church that at one time practiced polygamy. But as I look at most American religions, every American religion I know of has something to be ashamed of from the point of view of feminism.
But I'm no longer a believing woman. The feeling that if I was there, actively participating, that the assumption is that I believed it all, that I truly believed that Joseph Smith was a true prophet of God, that he was called by God, literally, and and visited by angels, and found gold plates, and translated a history of people who really lived here on the American continent, and who was restoring the power of God and all this. And through my studies, really, of history, I really came to believe that that was not true. And so I felt a conflict. It's hard. There really isn't a place in a believing group for the non-believer. There's no place of comfort, because you're seen as dangerous.
Some of the women were sweet enough and good enough to take in the second wives and make them feel happy. Others just hated them, and their kids hated each other. It was a terrible time for them.
Are you glad that you didn't live in that period?
No, I don't care what I live.
Yeah.
I lived where the Lord wanted me to.
Yeah.